Alright, got it. We are good with YouTube. All right. We're gonna go ahead and get started, everyone. Well, first, I would like to thank everyone for coming out to another edition of the AV Digital Classroom. My name is Darren Lee Calhoun II. I am the Facilities Public Program and Outreach Director at the AV Research Center for African American History and Culture. And again, it's great to welcome you all here. Quick notes about the AV: we will be opening up back to the public soon by appointment only. Please look out for our newsletter. If you are not signed up for our newsletter, please contact us and we'll get you signed up for our newsletter. But giving the in the next few weeks, we will be opening back up. We have a few great exhibitions coming in, including one from Mauro Masai, Alex Sears, a local artist down here in Charleston, who will be taking over our McKinley Washington Auditorium. Also with one of our great undergrad students, Anna Rucker, who will be taking over our Cox Gallery. And then we have another great exhibition looking at it's actually a community exhibition featuring community artwork going into our second floor changing gallery. So the next few weeks, I don't have a date yet. We will be open back up to the public, and we look forward to seeing everybody come by appointment only. So with that being said, we also have a special announcement tonight, as well as a few coming that you'll be seeing over the next few days. Over the last few weeks, we have finally chosen our 2022 James E. Campbell Scholars for the year. And if you don't know, the James E. Campbell Scholarship Scholar Award is given to students who will have a focus on social justice within the communities that they're in. It's open to all College of Charleston students, as well as every HBCU inside the state of South Carolina. Students can apply in a grant form to the AV Research Center, and with their project or research or conference that they want to go to, and we will give out funding to them named off of the great James E. Campbell, who passed last year. So this year we have 4 recipients of the Scholar Award, 2 from the College of Charleston, Anna Rucker, again, one of our students, as well as Javon Scott, who's a student in the education department, and then two great scholars up at the great Benedict College. We have Miss Ariana Bastain, who's at Benedict, as well as Mia Douglas. So we want to give them huge congratulations, and we'll be announcing more about that over the next few days. So now that we got all the housekeeping through, we're going to go ahead and get started with our program tonight. I'm excited. I'm very excited to invite Dr. DJ Polite to actually give his story tonight. Who he on Fraser Baker. Well, I believe we're talking about Fraser Baker tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and read his bio, and also I want to give a quick shout out to today being his publishing day. Dr. Polite has published his chapter on Fraser Baker that came out today, and is open for everyone to go out to Fordham Press and buy. It's on Amazon everywhere. And the chapter was actually published in the book called Reconstruction in the Empire: The Legacies of Abolition and Union Victory for an Imperial Age, edited by David Pryor. And his chapter is chapter 8, The Lynching of Fraser Baker, Violence from Reconstruction to Empire. So immediately after I finish his bio, he would jump in, and if you have any questions, please send any, write them inside of the chat. We look forward to having a lively discussion tonight. All right. Dr. DJ Polite is a historian with a PhD from the University of South Carolina, focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean. His dissertation was entitled Combating the Pillars of Political Supremacy, Democracy, Citizenship, Puerto Rican Autonomy under the US Jim Crow Empire. Specifically, his research looks at the intersections of Jim Crow excuse me, and empire through the lens of Puerto Rico's colonial condition and the paths of individual and group advocacy, Puerto Ricans to advance the causes of progress and the liberation under a system designed for political exclusion. So without further ado, we're going to go over, toss it over to DJ Polite, Dr. DJ Polite. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we look forward to talking with everyone soon.
All right, so thank you. This talk tonight is heavily based on the chapter that was published today. So if you want to hear more, read more on this kind of theme, of course you can read the book and read the chapter in the book. But I really am fascinated in a lot of my work on this question of Jim Crow and empire. The U.S. gained Puerto Rico, Philippines, Guam as territories in 1898. And the U.S. also, 1898, early 1900, the first decade of 1900 is really the heart of the start of the Jim Crow era. And a lot of my research is really around the idea that the U.S. does not gain territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific, really embark on being this overseas empire at the same time that they're doing Jim Crow in the U.S. South, that these didn't just happen side by side, but that they really influenced each other. That the same politicians who are really trying to embark on Jim Crow segregation are, of course, the same individuals in Congress who are invested in U.S. empire, and that they just can't siphon off and separate how they view African Americans in the U.S. South and how they view territories abroad, that they view these individuals very similarly. And so this really does look at one episode of that, looking at one lynching, looking at heavily the last African American in Congress, George Henry White, from North Carolina, looking at him reacting to all this violence in the South, the growth of U.S. empire, from that lens. And so I hope you'll see a lot of the same connections that I saw between Jim Crow and empire as we kind of work through tonight. So I want to take us back to actually about, what's this, 100? Actually, not that, we're about a week away from 124 years from this event. So on the night of February 21st, 1898, again, just a week away from the 124th anniversary, if you will. On the night of February 21st, 1898, in a wooden frame building on the outskirts of Lake City, South Carolina, the Baker family went to bed in their home, which also served as the local post office. The William McKinley administration had appointed Fraser Baker, an African American, as the federal postmaster of this predominantly white town. The Baker family had received threats from white citizens who openly disapproved of his appointment. Local whites lamented the elevation of an African American to a position of authority. In preceding weeks, white vigilantes had burned down the first post office, shot at Baker's African American assistant, and made threats against Baker's life. Now, around 1 a.m. on this chilly night, Fraser and his wife Lavinia awoke to find their rear wall ablaze. Fraser and his wife took on the double task of waking and attempting to protect their 6 children, while also trying to put out the blaze with the few water jugs around the home. As the fire spread and the water in their home ran low, Fraser told his eldest son, Lincoln, to run and cry for help. But as Lincoln opened the front door, shots rang out from the attackers lined outside. Dragging his son back in the home to safety, Fraser paced the living room, attempting to find a way out for him and his family. He turned to his wife, Lavinia, and told her they might as well die running. Backlit by flames, Fraser Baker was an easy target, and he was shot, dying in front of his family. As the rest of the Baker family fled, the wife, Lavinia, her hand was shot through, killing the 2-year-old baby, Julia, in her arms. Lavinia, standing in the flames with a dead husband and a dead child, managed to usher her remaining children, Rosa, Lincoln, Cora, Sarah, and Millie, into nearby bushes as the bodies of Fraser and the baby burned along with their home. The family hid and waited until the white assailants dispersed and local African Americans opened their homes to provide sanctuary. Now, the lynching of the Baker family is not new. Rather, it's part of a long history of racist violence against African Americans that occurred across the U.S. South, especially in South Carolina since the Civil War. South Carolina was the site of the infamous Ku Klux Klan trials from 1871 to 1872, in which the federal government seemed to promise protection from this terrorist organization. Yet by 1876, South Carolina was every bit as violent as evinced by the Hamburg and Ellington riots, more aptly called massacres. Occurring during a gubernatorial and presidential election, these massacres showed the violent measures that racist whites took to cement all-white political control. But in addition to racist violence, 1898 presented another challenge. Days before the lynching of the Bakers, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, bringing calls for military intervention in Spain's wars with its colonies. The Maine was not attacked, instead just exploding by accident. Nonetheless, the calls for war against Spain spread. The lynching of the Baker family and the start of the Spanish-American War are not just contemporaneous, happening at the same time. The sinking of the Maine and the lynching of the Baker family demonstrate the connections between the spread of U.S. empire and the solidification of local white control in the U.S. South. Now, I know you're probably asking, how did one really influence the other? Well, political actors both nationally and within South Carolina recognized the hypocrisy of promoting freedom and liberty abroad in Cuba, while African Americans were being lynched for exercising voting rights in the South. The discussions over empire and territorial acquisition at the end of the 19th century were in part framed by racial violence and disfranchisement in the U.S. South. Further, the racial violence in the Carolinas could not be divorced from memories of Reconstruction. The history of violence during and since Reconstruction was tied to this lynching and heightened the stakes of defining the boundaries of political inclusion. Repeatedly, political actors blurred the lines between the fall of Reconstruction in 1898, linking local racial violence to the question of U.S. empire. Connecting the racist violence in Lake City to questions about nation, state, and empire adds nuance to our understanding of why the U.S. undertook an imperial stance at the turn of the 20th century. For Southern conservatives with memories of Reconstruction, white supremacy needed to be secured at home before empire could be extended. After the experience of Reconstruction, during Reconstruction, federal occupation infringed on white supremacy. After the experience of Reconstruction, a key component of white supremacy was the exclusion of non-whites from political power, even if a minority of whites also suffered. Namely, if some segment of the white population has to suffer so that all African Americans or all minorities can be punished, that was a trade-off they were willing to take. Invested in white supremacy, white Southerners, seemingly anti-imperialists, also invested political and ideological energies on the connection between empire and racial violence. The threat of federal intervention in response to the lynching of Frazier Baker and Jim Crow racial hierarchy more generally was likened to the federal occupation during Reconstruction. Namely, if the U.S. government's going to send in any investigation of the Bakers, that's pretty much like Reconstruction, is what they're thinking. So to Southern white supremacists, the battle for proper political order needed to start at home. They must first control themselves, their land, their government, before imposing imperial control on other people. Racial domination elsewhere on other people abroad was uncertain if white Southern local control was absent or restrained. Southern white anti-imperialism was often conditional. They weren't always against empire. Once they were confident of the place of white supremacy at home, in their own towns, in their own state, they could warm to the idea of empire, to foreign occupation. empire could only extend from a firm white supremacist political foundation at home. Now, while the U.S. grappled with questions of Jim Crow and empire, it also had to come to terms with this, what to do with this lynching. The lynching of Fraser Baker and his family attracted attention from politicians and media from across the nation. Although some state and national figures condemned the lynching, others painted the violence as a predictable outcome of having an African American in a position of political authority. In South Carolina, the Lexington Dispatch called it one of the worst events in the states in years. Then Governor William Ellerby, initially refused to comment on the lynching at all. Then, after pressure, offered a reward for the apprehension of the lynching party. The Newberry Herald and News labeled the lynching, quote, one of the most horrible deeds that has ever taken place in a civilized society, end quote. However, even if they condemned the lynching, they largely remained ambivalent about what caused the lynching. The Dispatch condemned the actions of the unnamed white assailants, but also blamed President William McKinley and the state Republican Party for appointing an African American as postmaster in Lake City to begin with. Many of these publications and writers believed that the lynching would bring national scorn to the state of South Carolina. The scorn did come, and it was influenced by reactions to the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, right off the coast of Cuba. The lynching of the Bakers battled for national headlines and attention, with wartime furor arising from the alleged attack on the USS Maine. The calls for freedom and democracy abroad stood in stark contrast to the lynching in South Carolina. This tension was noted in several publications that explicitly linked the sinking of the Maine and the lynching in Lake City. Within one headline in South Carolina, they stated, quote, a crime more deplorable than the loss of 1,000 men in war, end quote. With the article saying that we would have preferred to see South Carolina lose 1,000 sons in battle than to have to record such a coward's crime as that which stains her today. While the lynching diminished the U.S.'s moral legitimacy on the questions of freedom and democracy, it was this cowardice that seemed to stain the country. Domestic lynchings revealed an unsettled racial order, and the nation needed to act quickly, resolutely, to shed this cowardice and restore the proper racial order. This theme of lynching as a stain on U.S. democracy recurred often, but exactly what was it staining wasn't always consistent. What was the stain? The New York Tribune stated that this savage crime was done by white American men instead of Spanish soldiery against Cuban rebels. The next day, the Tribune stated that the U.S. had better not preach humanity to the rest of the world while actions such as that in Lake City occurred unchallenged. The Washington Bee, an African-American newspaper, detailed the cold-blooded murder for their readers and called it a disgrace to the U.S. Constitution. The Washington Bee lamented that this lynching occurred while the country is all afire over the results with Spain. This sentiment was widespread as several African-American newspapers noted that the U.S. as a nation would lose support from the African-American community if the assailants in Lake City were left unpunished and the African-American community unprotected. Here, we kind of see a divergence in how deep the stain went. Broadly, white Americans framed the lynching as a surface thing, one that could be easily addressed, whereas African Americans presented it as a moral failing with deep and broad national roots. Whether in the case of South Carolina newspaper that labeled the lynching as an act of cowardice, or the New York Tribune that positioned the lynching as an act of savagery, each of these accusations were lobbed against the individuals that committed the lynching. Their acts did indeed shame the nation, but as individual failings were not representative of the nation. These lynchings represented bad acts by the individuals, not something deeply embedded within the nation or the national population. From the perspective of the African American community, the disgrace was not just the occurrence of the lynching, but how indicative of what it was of the widespread lack of protection of the African American community at large. as the U.S. contemplated war with Spain, the inability to protect innocent citizens at home was a disgrace to the Constitution and the principle of equal protection under the law. The idea of the scope and meaning of racial violence also harkened back to South Carolina's history of bloodshed over the racial boundaries of political power following emancipation and Confederate defeat in the Civil War. Condemnations of the Lake City lynching brought the memory of Reconstruction into that contemporary moment. The New York Tribune reminded its readership that South Carolina had attacked the authority of the federal government before at Fort Sumter, which triggered the Civil War. It argued that perhaps South Carolina needed to be reminded that the U.S. government is not to be trifled with. The New York Times concurred and said that the assailants should be brought to justice. Each of these were demonstrations that positioned the lynching in Lake City as outside the character of the wider U.S. The U.S. would not do this as bad actors. By saying that South Carolina needed to be reminded of what occurred after Fort Sumter, the implication was that the lynching was a Southern aberration. It was an event particular to South Carolina and to a South Carolina that was clinging to a far-off racist past that the U.S. overall had long vanquished. With rhetorical bluster, the U.S. nation could distance itself and is present from positioning from the foreign affairs, just positioning the lynching as separate and distinct, something of a far gone past. These calls for the U.S. federal government to intervene in the Lake City case, though, were not really easily ignored. The fact that Lake City was being linked to a longer history of racist violence only increased the pressure to react decisively, raising the stakes for those concerned with the nexus of race and political power. U.S. federal officials were pressed to react to such a flagrant attack on federal power, with civil rights activists concerned with African-American political inclusion leading the charge. Anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells Barnett repeatedly exhorted the McKinley administration to provide aid to the Baker family and to take control of the investigation. Ida B. Wells Barnett also worked with Representative George White, again, the only African-American left in Congress, to demand that indemnities, a debt, be paid and given to the Baker family. Representative White put forward a resolution to that effect in the House of Representatives, proposing a joint congressional committee to investigate the lynching. Meanwhile, White Senator William Ernst Mason, another Republican from Illinois, introduced a similar resolution in the Senate. Now, these resolutions resulted in pushback from South Carolina's most prominent politicians, since now the threat of federal intervention in South Carolina was no longer just rhetorical. The possibility of U.S. federal intervention in South Carolina troubled many white Southerners as a stark reminder of Reconstruction, a period they had hoped had passed. South Carolina's Senator John McLaurin, a Democrat of South Carolina, likened the federal investigation of the Fraser Baker lynching to the presence of federal troops during Reconstruction. In early March of 1898, McLaurin claimed, "Public sentiment is behind our state officers and forcing them to make every effort to secure the arrest and punishment of the perpetrators of this crime. Namely, we don't need a federal investigation. The state can handle it by ourselves." The message was that the state would handle its own affairs and the federal government should stay far away. From Senator McLaurin's standpoint, the idea of federal officials coming into the state of South Carolina to administer justice really looked too much like Reconstruction. Now, federal officials did indeed take control of the investigation, as a federal district attorney and postal inspectors conducted a 14-month-long investigation. This investigation continued in the background as Congress discussed the Spanish-American War and debated the parameters of annexation. Now, in South Carolina, the lynching of the Bakers was not just about a postmaster, but rather broader questions of who could exercise political control and the limits of that power. The 1895 South Carolina State Constitution effectively disfranchised South Carolina's African-American population. But the fact that Fraser Baker had occupied the federal position of postmaster was a visible reminder that African-American political participation had not yet been fully extinguished, and that a brief period of potential fuller Black citizenship was just over the state's shoulder, just like a shadow, just scaring them possibly. Now, the ensuing debates over how to deal with the lynching were not just debates about this single event in 1898. Rhetoric tied the lynching to the state's history of racist violence against African-American political mobilization to different ends and effects. For some, federal handling of the investigation was an echo of military occupation during Reconstruction to ensure that South Carolina respected federal authority. Even if the intention was not long-term occupation, the implication was that the federal government held ultimate authority and would bring the rogue region to heel. Those who decried federal intervention or interference defended their ability to effectively oppress those within their borders on their own terms, specifically African Americans. Such claims about sovereignty, states' rights, political control, and the delineation of racial and political borders segued easily into other discussions about the war with Spain and the potential annexation of new territories from Spain. Now, as white supremacist Southern politicians engaged in this imperial debate, they understood that the future of white segregationist politics was at stake. They sought a firmer definition of who would wield political power and where they could wield it. With the federal investigation of the Baker lynching underway, white racists within South Carolina believed that further threat of federal involvement was a demonstration that their own political supremacy was not firm. In effect, they themselves were held in an inferior position in a political hierarchy, is what they're telling themselves. If the federal intervention could come, then we are the truly oppressed. We white segregationists, white annexationists, white supremacists are the ones oppressed if the federal government could come in at any point. So debates over empire were really about, could they establish Jim Crow and cement all-white local control in South Carolina? Now, if you're here, you might have heard of this gentleman, but South Carolina Senator Benjamin Ryan Tillman is an archetype, a stereotype of white supremacist politics, and a representative example of a strand of Southern anti-imperialism rooted in staunch racism. Tillman served as governor of the state before serving as U.S. Senator from 1895 to 1918. As the state's governor, Tillman was intentional about South Carolina's disfranchisement laws being for the explicit purpose of white supremacy. Now, I've been asked a time or two, why do I call Senator Pitchfork Tillman a white supremacist? Well, because in his own writings, he wrote or helped write the state constitution for the explicit purpose of quote unquote white supremacy. He called himself a white supremacist. I'm only using the verbiage that he used about himself. Who am I to argue with a white supremacist if he wants to be called a white supremacist? Now, his racist rhetoric and fear-mongering demonstrate the ways in which Southern racism and transitions toward the acquisition of new territories went hand in hand. In discussing his approach to the imperial debate, one of his biographers stated, Tillman used the experience of white Southerners since emancipation to argue against bringing still more non-white races into uneasy coexistence with whites jealous of their own racial supremacy. Tillman's words and actions must be understood within a context in which the Baker lynching was central to the debate on empire. He opposed annexation not only based on exclusion of what he thought were racial inferiors from national politics. Rather, Tillman also focused on firmly entrenching the exclusion of what he saw as racially inferior African Americans at home, as he and his contemporaries saw fit. His anti-imperial views were tied to local white supremacist political concerns in South Carolina. Now, Tillman expressed his sentiments toward war with Spain through rhetoric that linked that local lynching to the international arena. Only a month after the Lake City investigation started, or Congress took control of the Lake City investigation, South Carolina newspapers printed Tillman's approach to the Spanish-American War. He was explicitly pro-war, but anti-annexation. Tillman advocated for the U.S. to aid the Cuban people with achieving independence, but he wanted to ensure that the U.S. did not claim Spain's territories post-war. He criticized President McKinley for being too hesitating in regard to a Spanish attack on the USS Maine. Tillman blamed Spain for its treatment of the Cubans, as he also blamed Wall Street businesses that had held financial interests on the island, particularly in sugar. Yet he was not an advocate of the Cubans as equal. Tillman believed that they were racially inferior. In fact, for him, the Spanish were also racially inferior. Despite his pro-war rhetoric, his main concern was back home in South Carolina. Tillman's speeches throughout 1898 revealed that first and foremost, he was open to annexation as long as white supremacy was his stated political foundation. Tillman criticized the possible annexation of Hawaii, and local papers understood this to be based on white supremacy. Tillman said that he did not object to annexation so long as Anglo-Saxons participated in the government. Tillman insisted that absolute anti-empire was not his stance. Annexation and expansion into Hawaii was an adequate position to hold, given that, yes, sugar interests did not hurt his state of South Carolina, and that Anglo-Saxons excluded the native populations from the political process. Tillman was not unique in adhering to a worldview in which Anglo-Saxon superiority and expansion went hand in hand. However, the Baker lynching and the threat of federal intervention unsettled Anglo-Saxon supremacy in South Carolina. Tillman was incapable of separating the two, empire and the lynching of the Baker family. Starting with the condemnation of Hawaiian annexation, he pivoted to criticizing the possible annexation of the other islands of the Pacific and Caribbean. He noted that the islands of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines were already populated with, quote, the races for which we have no affinity or liking, end quote. He continued, quote, we have already one perplexing and harassing problem right here at home, end quote. That perplexing problem was whether whites in South Carolina would be forced to share even limited political control with African Americans. To that end, Tillman made international concerns local, but could he make his local concerns into an international issue? The Spanish-American War presented the opportunity to do so, as African Americans across the country saw participation in the war as an opportunity to make greater claims to political and citizenship rights. So Spain, US, going to war with Spain. We said that they attacked the Maine. The Maine was not attacked. Didn't matter. Going to war with Spain. The McKinley administration called for African-American volunteers in the buildup for war, and the African-American community answered affirmatively. When in April of 1898, McKinley called for 125,000 African-American volunteers, broadly speaking, the call was answered as several communities nationwide set out to fill the quota. The rationale for the inclusion of African Americans in military service was mixed. Largely, there was kind of a mixed reaction to, should we send African Americans to fight anyway? Some who believed that they should be sent to fight believed that African Americans might be more immune to tropical diseases, and that is why they should go fight in Cuba and the Philippines. African Americans were not recruited under the belief of their standing as equal members of American society, nor were they seen to be equal members of the US military, afforded the same authority or gravitas. That much was clear when the African American troops came to Florida as part of this war mobilization. Much like events in South Carolina, the Tampa riots of June 1898 brought into sharp relief the tension of wartime mobilization and white unease at seeing African Americans serve in the US military. Florida had the closest port to Cuba and thus became the rallying point for entire regiments from across the nation. African Americans of the 24th and 25th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry were among the troops that gathered. The 24th and 25th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry, these Black troops, known as Buffalo Soldiers, were largely renowned for their fighting out in the U.S. West against Native American tribes. In many cases, this made them some of the more experienced troops, regardless of race, heading to Cuba. However, their experience did not entail respect and authority in Tampa, as their mere presence really unsettled racial mores. That much was clear one night when a white soldier from Ohio grabbed a local African-American toddler and holding the child upside down, that soldier issued a marksman challenge to see if anyone could shoot a hole through the Black child's sleeve. After this challenge, the child was left unharmed, but the news of this vile game reached the African-American regiments. The result was a night of violence, as the African-American troops sought vengeance for this unfathomable offense of playing chicken with a Black child. White and Black South Carolinians grappled with the meaning of, and possibility of African Americans serving in the U.S. military abroad as a reflection of power, opportunity, and rights at home. African American soldiers with experience and authority potentially taking justice into their own hands made a shocking sight for the nation's white supremacists, especially those in the U.S. South. After the Tampa riots, one South Carolina editor suggested that the African American soldiers be sent to the Philippines, where it would be, quote unquote, kill dick, kill devil between them and the Malays. The experience in Tampa reinforced the belief that armed African American troops were a threat to a white supremacist racial order. In South Carolina, this belief held tight as South Carolina Governor Ellaby refused altogether to arm Black troops. Even as South Carolina as a whole struggled to meet quotas for volunteer recruitment, the state disarmed African-American militiamen and shipped their weapons to Columbia, South Carolina for use by white volunteers. African-Americans still found their way from South Carolina to Cuba, not as soldiers, but as laborers. Blocked from participation as soldiers, these Black laborers said that they were, quote, happy to be leaving Charleston, end quote, for greater personal freedom and economic opportunity in the Caribbean island. What is more, the Spanish-American War brought African Americans from across the nation armed with rifles and wrapped in the U.S. military uniform across state and across international lines on their way from the U.S. West to Cuba. The lines between federal authority, states' rights and state sovereignty, and imperial strength blurred. This was just the opportunity for those invested in white supremacy to project their local concerns outward. So Tillman crafted a critique based on memories of federal military presence during Reconstruction to meld these local concerns within the issue of U.S. empire. He frequently used the image of carpetbaggery to understand U.S. federal action at home and abroad. While federal investigators had been dispatched to Lake City, the White House was considering military intervention in Cuba. The issue with military intervention in Cuba was whether the U.S. needed to recognize the independence of Cuba as a sovereign nation. In order to intervene, do they have to be an independent nation? In response to the McKinley administration's advocating a strategy of intervening without recognizing Cuba as independent, Tillman likened this to the condition of the South after the Civil War, when the country was, quote, overrun with carpetbaggers, end quote. Tillman and local newspapers' reference to the carpetbaggers in their, quote unquote, country is not to be overlooked. Tillman, 30 years after Reconstruction, still considered the U.S. South to be its own entity, occupied by a foreign power, influenced by a foreign element during the period of Reconstruction. The U.S. federal government was the foreign entity exercising its authority over local whites. Meanwhile, African Americans, despite their citizenship status, were, along with Northern carpetbaggers, still a foreign element to those like Tillman. African American inclusion in the political system diluted white political power. The carpetbagger theme shaped criticism of McKinley's policies by Tillman in several local South Carolina newspapers. Tillman critiqued calls for the U.S. to occupy Spanish island territories until they were pacified. He questioned who would define pacification. quote, the carpetbaggers who will be left in charge of the government until they have grown rich from plundering those impoverished Cubans. He continued, South Carolina was left by a foreign element in charge of her government, and they too remained here until pacification was accomplished, didn't they? End quote. Tillman clearly demonstrated a deep distrust of the federal government as not part of the U.S. South. It was also hyperbole to suggest that the U.S. South or the region's most ardent white supremacists had all been pacified. They hadn't. They had been equally as violent as they'd ever been. But he evoked that imagery to criticize calls for federal intervention in South Carolina's Lake City lynching and solidify the local power of white supremacy. Now, when the white mob murdered the Baker family, it was an expression of the violence of boundary making, of how groups use force to define themselves against others at home and abroad. Throughout the imperial debate, Tillman sought to protect his state's practice of white supremacy from those he deemed foreign or alien. Who constituted these foreign and alien elements was flexible. By midsummer of 1898, Tillman was engaged in a vigorous debate on the possible annexation of Hawaii, along with the Caribbean and Pacific Islands under Spanish control. The underlying focus of his rhetoric revealed that one issue at stake was the question of racial fitness for democracy. In his eyes, in the eyes of many of the South's white supremacists, a people who were perceived to be racially inferior could not be incorporated into the U.S. political system. Now, the possibility of territorial annexation and federal investigation of the white mob in Lake City reinforced Tillman's fear of the permeability of the nation's and his state's borders. After local South Carolina officials proved unable or unwilling to find the assailants of the Baker family, federal officials did indeed take over the case. Abiel Lathrop, a federal U.S. attorney from Charleston, was provided with resources to investigate. The resources included 2 postal investigators and a private detective. After additional requests, Lathrop was given the ability to remove potential witnesses from Lake City under government protection. By late June, 2 days before Tillman was haranguing about the blood and alien nature of the people from the Philippines and the Caribbean, deputy marshals arrested several men for being part of the Baker lynching party. As if to underscore the link between the lynching and the Spanish-American War in the minds of South Carolinians, 4 of the men who were arrested were apprehended at Camp Fitzhugh Lee while training for war with Spain. The federal U.S. Marshal sent for the arrest was confronted by a Captain Davis, who refused to allow any arrest unless he received explicit written instruction from the Secretary of War to do so. Here, the lines and jurisdiction between state, nation, empire were anything but clear. The federal arrest on a South Carolina military base of white men volunteering for war because of their lynching of a black man actively blurred the lines among the local, the national, and the international. When Tillman remarked that a foreign element had been left in charge of South Carolina's government during Reconstruction, he positioned the federal government as alien to his region. Now the federal government simply took control of local South Carolina affairs for the sake of African-American political power. The presence of U.S. Marshals on a South Carolina base, apprehending white South Carolina volunteers, was difficult to disassociate from Reconstruction memory. If the Spanish-American War provided a period to negotiate the political boundaries between state, nation, and empire, then Lake City and the lynching of the Bakers was muddying the waters. For Tillman, the alien and the foreign were indeed legion and coming from multiple directions. If there was meant to be a clear racial hierarchy of political power, racist white South Carolinians were seemingly being excluded or being pushed down the hierarchy by the federal government. If the Spanish-American War was meant to bring reunion to the North and the South, these imagined white regions of the nation, Lake City and Empire, were proving to be impediments. Now, the November elections of 1898 brought more national scrutiny to North and South Carolina as racist whites engaged in murder and local coups across the region. In Phoenix, South Carolina, a local Republican family challenged provisions in the 1895 state constitution that disfranchised African-American men. Local white Democrats not only repressed this challenge, but lynched and murdered at least 8 African-Americans in the town for good measure. Meanwhile, whites in Wilmington, North Carolina, executed a coup d'etat against African-American local government. Led by former Confederate generals, racist whites not only forced elite African-Americans from power, but stole their property, turning African-American citizens into refugees. Lake City brought the initial focus of the federal government to the Carolinas. Phoenix and its bloodshed increased the Carolinas' notoriety for violence on behalf of local all-white political power. The Wilmington attack, one of the most notorious race massacres in U.S. history, underlined that the Carolinas were no home for African-American democratic participation. Starting with Lake City in February, the bloodshed of 1898 marked the boundaries of political control in the Carolinas. In response to these massacres, Tillman measured several threats to his perceived local white supremacy in the state. On one hand, he feared the influence of federal government in state politics, as the U.S. South was in the process of enacting Jim Crow legislation. On the other hand, he encouraged the violence that led up to the Wilmington riots. As a reported 1,000 mounted men participated in a rally in Charlotte, North Carolina, Tillman egged on violence with reference to white supremacist outrage surrounding an African-American editor, Alexander Manley. As Tillman remarked, quote, "In South Carolina, no Negro editor could slander the white women of the state as that Wilmington Negro did," end quote. And that as punishment, Manley should be food for catfish at the bottom of the Cape Fear River. His insistence that bloodshed was an option to enforce the boundaries of local political white supremacy threatened to erase the boundaries between local control and federal power, and in fact imperiled the political apartheid that white supremacists were attempting to build. Media attention only increased political scrutiny. Whether from Newberry, Lancaster, Yorkville, Anderson, or Sumter, South Carolina newspapers printed stories about the race wars and the bloodshed in Phoenix and linked them with the events of Wilmington on their front pages. The news of massacres, coups, and murders in the Carolinas spread beyond the region. Now, the upheaval in Wilmington brought calls for federal intervention to aid the newly displaced African community. But the Washington Post conjectured that it was South Carolina that caused President McKinley and his cabinet the most concern, because it was in South Carolina that the situation was much more serious in Wilmington, because it was federal officials that had been driven from their posts. A reference clearly to the events in Lake City. Whether this was true of the McKinley administration or not, from the perspective of the Washington Post, South Carolina was of dire political concern. Now, in Wilmington, the crisis was a local matter. African Americans had been displaced from local municipal seats. In South Carolina, Fraser Baker had been a representative of the federal government. After the violence during the November elections, the connections and tension between local Southern violence and international empire was palpable. To sustain the foundation of Jim Crow in his state, Tillman reached all the way back to Reconstruction and outwards toward empire. A week after the election day massacres, he remarked that these killings were lamentable, but justifiable given the trials of Southern white men during Reconstruction. He proclaimed that the attention on his state consisted of political and hypocritical attacks from Northern Republicans. He decried those who attacked disfranchisement in the South while ignoring similar disfranchisement in overseas territories. Tillman said in his home county, Edgefield, that the white men at Phoenix, remembering our own troubles in 1876, were angered by so barefaced and outrageous a travesty on legal voting, and thus the conflict between the races came about. In his logic, attacks on the legal disfranchisement of African American voters urged racial animosity and racial violence in the South. This struggle for white supremacist sovereignty left little room for George White, the last remaining Black congressman. George Henry Wright, the U.S. House representative from Tarboro, North Carolina, had worked with Ida B. Wells Barnett to bring resolutions addressing the Lake City lynching. He was also in favor of overseas territorial expansion. In a speech in the U.S. House of Representatives, he noted his long support for all previous measures to liberate the Cuban people from Spain. He used his support for the war as an opportunity to speak in Congress about race and political power within the nation and his region. George Henry White noted that he was the single African-American representative. Pivoting from the international to the domestic, White noted that the people in the territories were frequently linked to African-Americans in debate over race, democracy, and citizenship. White said, quote, "I have heard them referred to as savages, as aliens, as brutes, as vile and vicious and worthless," end quote. White objected to those such as McLaurin and Tillman who linked the people of the territories to the African-American community, his community. He espoused a pro-American expansionism, yet he criticized the vast disfranchisement rising in the South and the wider system of white supremacy. He had worked with Ida B. Wells Barnett to bring justice for the Bakers who were lynched in Lake City. Yet here, White contended with the expansion of the U.S. empire's boundaries and the broader language of white supremacy. He was cognizant of any debate on racial fitness for political power implicitly concerned the African-American community. White noted that most South Carolina congressional Democrats had won an election without vast voter participation, having relied on voter suppression and disfranchisement of the U.S. South's Black population. To this point, White accused his white political colleagues, quote, "You have got the idea that any means that will disfranchise him and prevent him from exercising the rights which are given him under the Constitution is legitimate," end quote. The overthrow of democratically elected officials in Wilmington added weight and urgency to this assertion. He then pressed on to the question of annexation. He called for the U.S. to take hold of those in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippine Islands. To this, he received prolonged applause. But overlooked was his caveat that first the U.S. must recognize your citizen at home and give them the rights that they are justly entitled to. Now, I want to fast forward. Now, the Treaty of Paris ended the war against Spain, and it passed by a margin of only 2 votes. With such a thin margin, the positive vote of John McLaurin, Democratic Senator of South Carolina, was a crucial swing vote. Earlier works noted that McLaurin was swayed to vote in favor of the expansion, despite his own anti-annexation sentiments. His vote was gained by being granted political patronage by Republican McKinley administration, specifically in the form of selecting federal positions within the state of South Carolina. McLaurin, who served on the Committee of Claims and the Committee on Indian Affairs, was given the power to select all the postmasters in South Carolina. This occurred as the charged assailants of Fraser Baker's family in Lake City still awaited trial. From the standpoint of white supremacists in South Carolina, the lynching of Fraser Baker's family did not actually result in the coming of federal troops, but rather greater political power in exchange for a vote in favor of imperial expansion. For all the attention given to that case and the subsequent racial massacres, the federal government did not come to uphold the political power of African Americans in the South. After Phoenix, despite brief mentions that federal intervention might come to instill order, it did not arrive. The displaced African Americans from Wilmington lost their homes and did not receive recompense. As for George White, in his impassioned plea to recognize the African American citizen at home, by 1902, he was no longer a member of Congress, and no other African American served in Congress for several decades. 2 months after the passage of the Treaty of Paris, the 11 accused stood trial in Charleston for the murder of the Bakers. Despite several witnesses testifying, the case ended in a mistrial with all 11 walking free. The case was not retried. If anything, the imperial annexation debate added extra leverage for those such as McLaurin to shore up local control and white supremacy in the state. In essence, one of the crucial votes in favor of imperial expansion was bought and paid for at the expense of African American lives and political power in the Carolinas. I'll stop there.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Polite. I really do appreciate you hopping on and talking to us about this amazing parallel that you found. And we're gonna open up the floor for questions right now to the chat. But first, I did want to give two comments. First, I wanted to give a shout out to the great Dr. Faustinia Baker, who we lost last year, who was the great granddaughter, grand niece of Dr. Fraser Baker. She would have been working on the story and trying to get also trying to get she helped with getting the marker put inside of Lake City, but also, as well as writing a book on just getting that story about Fraser Baker out. So we definitely want to give a shout out to her and the Baker family. Also, I wanted you to say it one more time for the people in the back. We always had anytime I'm talking to somebody trying to get who opposes taking down the Tillman statue in Colombia, they always say how he was just a staunch supporter of states' rights and how everything he did and everything he said was to bring back so South Carolina would not lose their political power on the national arena. But hearing you actually make that parallel to the Spanish-American War and then also to the Hawaiian annexation, I don't think they can actually negate half of those things, anything that you said. But bringing that into context, how would you see where we are now with the American annexations across the world? How would you bring what we were going through back during 1898 and the years following to the present day, particularly seeing where we're at right now with Puerto Rico?
So I always think of this in this way. At core on the question of both Jim Crow and empire was who could have full citizenship rights. Full citizenship rights. You could be a citizen and not have all citizenship rights. African Americans understand that very clearly. That was part of Jim Crow. I'm a member of the US, and yet I have no voting rights. That same logic was applied to those, say, in Puerto Rico. We're going to grant you citizenship, and you're not going to have voting rights. And that is still the case. I mean, we look at Washington, D.C., a majority African-American city, and they're still just like, I'm a citizen, and yet I have no representation in Congress. And Puerto Rico still, they're like, we're citizens, and we have no representation in Congress. It's the same question, is how can we have citizens who don't have full citizenship rights? It's obscene. It's an absurd thing that is just a stark remnant of Jim Crow and empire. This question of how can we hold political power over people we deem unfit? It's the same question. And we see it now with new voting rights laws now. Who is part of the policy? Who is part of the American populace? Who deserves full rights and protections under the law? And who doesn't? And for whose benefit? And somehow, African Americans somehow get the short end of the stick, or anyone deemed racially inferior.
Absolutely, thank you. And if you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask them in the chat. And while we do that, can you go ahead and please plug your book and your chapter one more time while we see if we have any other questions in the chat?
Yeah, so the book is called Reconstruction and Empire, and my chapter is the Lake City Lynch. I'm going to pull that up again. It's chapter 8, and it is largely based on this chapter right here, the lynching of Fraser Baker. It's titled "The Lynching of Fraser Baker: Violence from Reconstruction to Empire."
Absolutely. And what other research or work are you working on now?
So right now I'm actually expanding on Wilmington a lot more. I really want to talk about Wilmington then. I mentioned it briefly in the context of this larger scope of racial violence, but I really want to focus in on Wilmington and its imperial kind of ramifications. I mean, how do you turn a city of African Americans into refugees in their own country is wild to me. It has so much context for how we think of refugees, who is considered a refugee and who is deserving of help, of aid from the US government. And so I'm really thinking about the Wilmington Massacre and its influence on questions of aid, of help, of empire moving forward.
Right. And I mean, with you even saying that makes me think, taking it even further back with David Walker's appeal and how that shaped a lot of South Carolina politics after that dropped out. Well, I don't see any other questions inside of the chat. So again, I would just want to thank you for hopping on. If anybody has not seen, if anybody wants to come back and rewatch, you can always catch it on our YouTube page and the Avery Digital Classroom. It will be on all of our socials. Please follow us on all of our socials. I guess that is Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and the thing don't know anything about is TikTok. We do have a TikTok. We will be opening back up very soon. As I said at the beginning, the Avery Research Center will be back open to the public. The museum will be back open to the public very soon. I will let you know when. Can't give you a date, but when we are ready, we will be right back open. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming down and everybody watching us on the Avery Digital Classroom on YouTube. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you all soon. And let's all give another shout out to Dr. DJ Polite. Your research is amazing. We appreciate you coming on with us tonight.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Peace. Thank you, everybody.
Good with everything with the live?